The village laughed at him. But he had a hidden plan. In the spring of 2012, in Fillmore County, Nebraska, a 43-year-old man named Dale Rutker stood alone in a field that hadn't produced a meaningful harvest in 2 years. The ground beneath his boots was cracked in patterns that looked like old ceramic pottery someone had dropped from a great height. The county had received 6.4 inches of rainfall since the previous October, less than half the historical average of 14.2 inches for that period. The United States Drought Monitor had designated the region as D3, or extreme drought, one category below the worst classification possible. Across Nebraska that year, corn yields had dropped to 89 bushels per acre, compared to the 5-year average of 166. The USDA estimated crop losses in the state at $1.1 billion for the 2012 season alone. Dale's neighbors were already talking. Not loudly, rural Nebraska doesn't work that way. But the talk was there, in the glances exchanged at the elevator in Geneva, in the pauses before someone changed the subject at the co-op. Dale Rutker had done something 3 years earlier that almost no one in the county had understood, and now, with the land drying up around him, the general consensus was settling quietly into the shape of a verdict: the man had made a terrible mistake. He didn't look like a man making a mistake. He looked like a man who was waiting. Dale Rutker was born in 1969 on the same 480-acre parcel that his grandfather Earl Rutker had broken sod on in 1931. Earl had come from a long line of German immigrants who had arrived in the Platte River Valley in the 1880s with a belief, almost theological in its firmness, that the earth rewarded patience and punished shortcuts. Dale's father, Leonard, farmed the same ground through the 1970s and 1980s, surviving 2 recessions, the farm crisis of 1986 that wiped out a third of Nebraska's farm operations, and several stretches of dry years that would have broken someone without Leonard's particular combination of stubbornness and financial conservatism. Dale grew up doing what farm children in that part of the world do. He walked bean fields in July pulling cocklebur and water hemp. He drove a grain cart at 11 because his father needed an extra hand during harvest. He learned to read the sky the way other children learn to read books, not from any romantic impulse, but because the sky was information, and information on a farm was survival. He was a quiet student, not because he lacked intelligence but because he processed things slowly and seriously, the way you learn to process things when every decision on a farm has a consequence that arrives months later. He graduated from the University of Nebraska, Lincoln in 1991 with a degree in agronomy, one of 14 students in his cohort who went back to farm rather than into industry or extension work. Most of the others were gone from farming within a decade. Dale came home and farmed with his father for 8 years before Leonard's knees made the work impossible. By 2002, Dale was running the operation alone, 480 owned acres and an additional 240 rented from 2 neighboring landowners, for a total working base of 720 acres. His rotation was simple and typical for the region: corn 1 year, soybeans the next, repeat. He applied anhydrous ammonia in the fall, herbicide in the spring, and whatever the crop consultant from the local co-op recommended between those 2 anchor events. He planted Pioneer hybrids because his father had planted Pioneer hybrids. He sold his corn to the Heartland Cooperative Elevator in Geneva at whatever price the board showed that morning. It was, in every way, the standard model. And for a long time, it worked. The first signal Dale noticed wasn't financial. It was physical. Around 2005, he began to see something he'd never quite paid attention to before. After a hard rain, the water was running off his fields faster than it used to. Not all his fields, specifically the ones he'd been working the hardest with heavy tillage equipment. He had a John Deere 8520 with a 6-bottom plow, and he'd been using it aggressively since the early 2000s because the crop consultant had told him that deep tillage would break up compaction and improve drainage. The drainage had improved, but so had the runoff. The topsoil in the waterways was darkening the ditch water after heavy rains in a way he found troubling. He didn't mention this to anyone at first. There wasn't a language for it in his world, not a comfortable one. The conversations at the elevator and the co-op and the equipment dealer were all about yield, inputs, and price. Nobody talked about what the soil itself was doing, at least not in the terms Dale was beginning to think about. In the winter of 2006, he drove to Lincoln and attended a conference at the University Extension Building. It was a small event, maybe 60 farmers in a room designed for 90, and the presenter was a soil scientist named Dr. Yolanda Ferris, who had spent 15 years studying what she called soil biology, the microbial ecosystems, the fungal networks, the aggregate structure of healthy versus degraded soil. She used the phrase soil organic matter more times in her presentation than Dale had heard it used in his entire life combined. He sat in the back row and took notes in a small spiral notebook, the same type he used to track field observations back home. He filled 17 pages. He stayed after the presentation ended and talked to Dr. Ferris for 40 minutes while the room emptied around them. She was direct and careful in the way that scientists who have spent years trying to translate their work for skeptical audiences learn to be. She did not oversell. She said that soils managed with continuous tillage and high synthetic nitrogen inputs typically showed organic matter levels of 1 to 2%. She said that soils managed with reduced tillage, diverse rotations, and cover crops, she listed winter rye, hairy vetch, radishes, could hold 4 to 6% organic matter over time, sometimes more. She said that each 1% increase in soil organic matter allowed a soil to hold approximately 20,000 additional gallons of water per acre. She said this with the flatness of someone stating a fact that had already been verified many times and was no longer interesting to argue about. Dale drove home in the dark on Highway 6, past the flat white fields under a cold January sky, doing arithmetic in his head. The arithmetic was not simple, and the more he worked through it over the following months, the more complicated it became, not in the numbers themselves, but in the implications of what the numbers meant for how he had been operating. His yield average for corn over the previous 5 years was 158 bushels per acre. His input cost per acre, seed, fertilizer, herbicide, fuel, machinery depreciation, crop insurance, was running approximately $480. His land rent on the 240 rented acres was $180 per acre. Corn was trading around $3.80 per bushel in 2006. At 158 bushels, his gross revenue per acre was $600.40. After inputs and rent on the rented ground, his net margin was thin enough that any disruption, a bad year, a price drop, an equipment failure, pushed him into deficit. The industrial model he was operating in was not designed for people like Dale. It was designed for scale. The companies selling him seed, fertilizer, and chemicals operated on volume. The elevator bought his corn and sold it forward at margins that made sense at millions of bushels. The banks that financed operating loans understood the system and were comfortable with it as long as land values kept rising, which they had been doing reliably in Nebraska since the early 2000s. In 2006, farmland in Fillmore County was trading at roughly $3,200 per acre. By 2012 it would reach $8,500. The land price inflation gave everyone in the system, farmers, lenders, landlords, a sense of security that was based more on asset values than on the actual economics of growing food. Dale saw this. He didn't articulate it as a systemic critique, that wasn't his language, but he felt it as a practical problem. He was working 720 acres, spending enormous amounts of energy and money, and the margin for error was getting smaller every year even as his yields stayed respectable. Something in the system was not adding up. He began reading. He read the work of Gabe Brown, a North Dakota rancher who had transitioned his operation from conventional grain farming to what he called regenerative agriculture, incorporating livestock, diverse crop rotations, and the complete elimination of tillage. He read research papers from the Rodale Institute in Pennsylvania. He ordered a book on soil food webs that had been written for a scientific audience and was not easy reading, and he read it twice. He began corresponding by email with 2 farmers in Kansas and 1 in South Dakota who were running no-till operations with cover crop programs. The more he read, the more he became convinced that the standard model he was operating was not just financially marginal, it was actively degrading the thing he was trying to farm. The soil. The ground itself. The organism, as Dr. Ferris had called it. In the spring of 2009, Dale Rutger made his decision. He told no one in advance, not because he was secretive by nature, but because he understood instinctively that the conversation would go nowhere useful if it happened before he had committed. He called the co-op and canceled his anhydrous ammonia order for the fall. He returned 3 phone calls from the Pioneer seed rep and told the man he was going to run a different seed variety that year, one with a shorter maturity date that would allow him to terminate the crop earlier and establish a cover crop behind it. He called a seed company in Iowa that specialized in cover crop mixes and ordered 2,400 pounds of a blend containing cereal rye, hairy vetch, crimson clover, turnips, and daikon radishes. He paid $8.40 per pound, a total investment of just over $20,000 that had no precedent in his operations history and no clear line in his cash flow projections to absorb it comfortably. He also made a second call that the county would later discuss with more agitation than anything else. He called his two landlords and told them he was changing his farming practices. He explained what no-till farming was, what cover crops were, what he expected to happen to their fields over the next several years, and what he expected the financial trajectory to look like. One of the landlords, a retired schoolteacher in Lincoln named Margaret Hooper who had inherited the ground from her late husband, listened carefully and said she trusted him and to go ahead. The other landlord, a man named Gary Pfister who farmed 1,800 acres himself several miles east, was quiet for a long moment and then said that he hoped Dale knew what he was doing. That fall, Dale planted his cover crop blend across all 720 acres. It came up in late October in a mat of green that was visible from the road. People drove past and looked. Within 2 weeks, the phone calls began. The first person to call was Dale's brother-in-law, a man named Kevin Schreiber who farmed 1,200 acres in York County and who considered himself reasonably progressive in his methods. Kevin was not unkind about it. He explained, in the careful way of someone who believes they are being helpful, that the cover crop seed was an expense that Dale would not recover in yield, that winter rye in particular had allelopathic properties that could suppress his corn germination the following spring, and that he was taking a significant risk at a time when margins were already tight. Kevin had spoken to the co-op agronomist, who agreed with him. Dale thanked Kevin and said he appreciated the concern. Gary Pfister called a week later and was less gentle. He asked whether Dale had talked to a lender about what this was going to do to his operating line. He asked whether Dale had considered what would happen to the ground's weed pressure if he stopped tillage. He said that he had seen no-till tried in this part of Nebraska before and it had not worked, and that the farmers who had tried it had gone back to conventional within 2 or 3 years. He said this county had a specific soil type, Hastings silty clay loam, heavy textured, with drainage characteristics that required active management, and that no-till cover crop systems had been developed in other parts of the country with different soils and different rainfall patterns, and maybe they worked there, but he had serious doubts about whether they worked here. It was a thorough, knowledgeable argument. Gary Pfister was not a foolish man. He was a good farmer by the standards of his system, and his concern was genuine and grounded in real experience. Dale listened to all of it. He said he understood the risks. He said he had done a lot of reading and thinking. He said he might be wrong, but he didn't think he was. He thanked Gary for the call. After he hung up, he sat at the kitchen table for a while. His wife, Carol, was at the counter doing something with the dishes. She did not say anything for a few minutes, and then she said, quietly, that she hoped he was sure about this. He said he was as sure as he could be about anything that took this long to show results. She said that was not especially reassuring. He said he knew. The tension between them over the next 3 years was not the dramatic kind. It was the quiet kind that accumulates in a farm family when one partner has made a decision that carries financial risk and the other partner is living inside that risk every day. Carol worked part-time at the elementary school in Geneva and managed the household books with a precision that Dale respected completely. She knew exactly what their operating line looked like. She knew that the cover crop investment had consumed their cash reserve and that the first year of no-till almost always showed a yield dip as the soil biology began to shift. She watched the numbers with the look of someone watching a pot they are afraid will boil. The first 2 years were hard in the specific way that transitions are hard, not catastrophic, but costly and uncertain in ways that are difficult to explain to people who are not living them. In 2010, Dale's corn yield came in at 141 bushels per acre, 17 bushels below his 5-year average, and 11 bushels below the county average that year. The cover crop termination timing had been slightly off, and there was some nitrogen immobilization in the soil as the rye biomass decomposed, which the agronomist at the co-op explained with barely concealed satisfaction. The soybeans that year were actually up slightly, 47 bushels per acre versus his average of 44, but soybeans were trading at $9.80 per bushel, and the improvement was partially offset by the lower corn number. Gary Pfister did not call again, which was its own form of communication. In 2011, things were better. The corn came back to 154 bushels per acre, still below his old average but within acceptable range. More importantly, Dale had begun to notice things in his fields that didn't show up in the yield monitor but that he tracked carefully in his notebook. The soil was changing in a way that was visible to someone who knew what to look for. Earthworm populations were increasing noticeably in the fields that had been under cover crops for 2 years. The soil surface in spring was staying moist several days longer after rain events. In his heaviest textured field, the 80-acre parcel on the south end that had always pond during wet springs, he saw almost no surface runoff from a 1.8-inch rain in late April, where previously that same field would have shed water visibly. He wrote this down. He did not mention it to anyone except Carol, and Carol's response was the carefully measured kind that meant she was not yet ready to let herself feel relieved. Then came 2012. The drought that struck the central United States in 2012 was the worst since 1956. The summer was brutal and specific. June heat arrived early, corn entered the critical pollination window in mid-July with temperatures regularly above 100 degrees and relative humidity in the 20s. In Fillmore County, the July rainfall total was 0.6 inches. Historical average for July is 3.4 inches. The county corn yield that year crashed to 86 bushels per acre. Some fields came in at 40 or 50. Some were abandoned before harvest. Dale Rutger's corn, across all 720 acres, yielded 124 bushels per acre. He did not announce this. He did not make any calls. He drove his combine through his fields in September in the same unhurried way he had always moved through harvest, and the yield monitor told him what it told him. He wrote the number down. 124 bushels per acre versus the county average of 86. 38 bushels more per acre. Across his 480 owned acres of corn that year, the difference amounted to approximately 18,240 bushels, more than 300,000 additional pounds of grain, at a drought-inflated price of $7.40 per bushel, a revenue difference of roughly $135,000 compared to what the county average would have produced on the same acreage. The reason was not magic. It was water. The soil on Dale's fields, after 3 years of cover cropping and no-till, had rebuilt enough organic matter to hold significantly more moisture. Soil tests run in 2011 had shown his organic matter averaging 3.2%, up from 1.8% when he had started the transition. Using Dr. Ferris's numbers, which were not her numbers alone but were consistent across several decades of soil science literature, that improvement in organic matter was holding an additional 28,000 gallons of water per acre. In a drought year, when every gallon of stored soil moisture was the difference between a plant completing pollination and a plant aborting its ear, that stored water was worth exactly as much as the difference in the yield monitor showed. It had worked because the soil had remembered water that the sky refused to provide. Word moved the way word moves in rural Nebraska, slowly, laterally, person to person, with a great deal of looking at the ground before people said what they were thinking. The first to say anything directly was Margaret Hooper, the retired schoolteacher. She called in October and said she had heard his yield numbers from somewhere, she didn't say where, and she wanted to tell him that she was glad she had trusted him. He said he appreciated that. She asked if there was anything she could do to support what he was doing, and he said no. Just keep the ground rented to him and he would keep doing what he was doing. Gary Pfister drove over in November. He came to the door and said he'd like to see Dale's cover crop fields if Dale didn't mind showing him. Dale minded not at all. They walked 3 fields in the November cold, Gary asking questions in the direct, practical way of a man who has reassessed his situation and is collecting information rather than defending a position. He asked about termination timing. He asked about the specific seed mix and where Dale sourced it. He asked what the soil tests showed. He did not say he had been wrong, because that is not how that conversation goes in that part of the world. But he shook Dale's hand at the end with a grip that said what words wouldn't. By spring of 2013, 6 farmers in Fillmore County had called Dale to ask about cover crops. By 2015, the Fillmore County Soil and Water Conservation District had added a cost-share program for cover crop seed, with Dale Rutger listed in the program documentation as the demonstration cooperator whose fields had provided the local proof of concept. The cost-share program eventually paid out more than $240,000 to participating farmers in its first 4 years. The financial arc of Dale's operation over the decade following his transition is worth laying out plainly, because the numbers tell a story that the narrative around regenerative agriculture often fails to make concrete enough. In 2009, when Dale began his transition, his total input cost per acre was $480: fertilizer, herbicide, seed, fuel, machinery. His net margin was approximately $90 per acre in an average year, which on 480 owned acres was $43,200, a workable income for a single family on a modest operation, but with almost no room for error. By 2015, his fertilizer costs had dropped by approximately 60%. The soil biology that cover crops and no-till had rebuilt was fixing nitrogen in quantities that his soil tests confirmed. He was running mycorrhizal fungal networks in his soil that were pulling phosphorus from rock particles that synthetic fertilizers had never been able to access. His total fertilizer spend had dropped from $142 per acre to $57. His herbicide costs had also declined, not eliminated, but reduced by about 40% because the cover crop canopy was suppressing weed germination in ways that his old clean-tilled fields had never achieved. His machinery costs had dropped substantially as well. Without tillage passes, he was running his equipment far fewer hours per year. His old 6-bottom plow had been sold in 2010. He had not replaced it. He estimated his machinery depreciation and repair cost at roughly $95 per acre in 2009. By 2015 it was closer to $60. By 2015, his total input cost per acre had fallen to approximately $320, from $480. His yield, after the transition dip of 2010, had recovered and begun to climb, reaching 171 bushels per acre for corn in 2015, above his pre-transition average. The combination of lower costs and stable to improving yields meant that his net margin per acre had grown to approximately $160 in an average year. On 480 owned acres, that was $76,800, nearly double what the same operation had produced in 2009. He did not expand aggressively. He was offered additional rented ground 3 times between 2013 and 2018 and declined each time. His view was that expansion diluted management attention and that management attention was his actual competitive advantage. He was right about this in a way that became clearer over time. The farmers who expanded rapidly during the high land price years of 2010 to 2014 took on debt loads that became very heavy when commodity prices collapsed in 2015 and 2016. Corn dropped to $3.20 per bushel in 2016. Several of the larger operations in Fillmore County renegotiated operating loans that year. Dale did not. His lower cost structure meant that $3.20 corn still covered his costs and left a margin, thin but real. There is a specific kind of quiet satisfaction that comes from having been correct about something that other people said was wrong, and that satisfaction arrived not in a single moment but in a series of small confirmations over years. Dale was not a man given to saying "I told you so." He was a man who kept his notebook, walked his fields in the early morning, and noticed things. What he noticed by 2017 and 2018 was that his soil had continued to change in ways that even he had not fully anticipated. His organic matter levels, retested in 2016, had reached an average of 4.1% across his own acres. The water infiltration on his fields, the rate at which rainfall moved into the soil rather than running off, had improved so dramatically that a 2-inch rain event no longer produced any visible runoff on the majority of his acreage. The fields that had pond in wet springs were not ponding. The ditch water downstream from his farm had cleared considerably since the early years of his transition. He noticed this because he had a specific memory of what it used to look like. He also noticed something he had not read about in quite the terms he was experiencing it: his yields were becoming more stable. Less volatile. In the broader corn market, yield volatility was a constant topic: drought years, wet years, disease pressure, late planting. On Dale's fields, the swings were smaller. The drought resilience he had seen in 2012 was not a one-time event, it was a structural feature of his soil system. In the moderate drought of 2017, when county yields dropped about 18% from the previous year, his dropped about 7%. In the wet spring of 2019, when several conventional neighbors had planting delayed by 3 weeks due to pond fields, he was in the ground on time. Stability, he had come to understand, was worth something that the market did not explicitly price but that showed up clearly in the numbers year after year: less risk, less borrowing, less anxiety. By 2020, the story of Dale Rutger's farm had moved beyond Fillmore County. Dr. Ferris, the soil scientist he had spoken with 14 years earlier in Lincoln, had used his farm as a case study in 2 published papers and in testimony before a USDA advisory panel on soil health policy. She cited his soil organic matter data, his input cost reduction figures, and his yield stability numbers during the 2012 drought. The case study did not use sensational language. It said, in the careful, qualified prose of peer-reviewed science, that a transition to no-till cover crop management in heavy silty clay loam soils of the Central Platte River Valley had produced statistically significant improvements in soil water holding capacity, reduced input costs of approximately 33% over a 6-year period, and maintained or improved corn yields after an initial 2-year transition period. It noted that drought year yield losses were approximately 55% lower on the transition farm than the county average. 3 USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service field offices in Nebraska used Dale's farm as a site visit destination for farmers considering enrollment in the agency's Conservation Stewardship Program. In 2021 and 2022, approximately 140 farmers from across the Central Plains visited Dale's operation in small groups, walking his fields and asking the same kinds of questions Gary Pfister had asked in the cold November of 2012. Dale answered all of them. He had gotten better at it over the years, not more dramatic or promotional, but more precise. He could explain the science of soil aggregate stability in language that connected to what a farmer could see and feel walking across a field in spring. He could explain the economics in numbers that came from his own operation rather than a research farm. He could explain the transition risk honestly, because he had lived it. He did not tell anyone it was easy. It was not easy. It required patience in quantities that the agricultural system around him was not designed to reward or support. The crop insurance program, for most of his transition period, was calibrated to his county average yields, which meant that when his yields dipped in 2010, his coverage ratio actually hurt him slightly, because his established production history was based on higher conventional yields. The operating lender at his bank in Geneva was supportive but cautious, and for the first 3 years of his transition, Dale felt the weight of that caution in the conversations he had to have every spring when the operating loan renewed. The system was not built for what he was doing. It was built for a different kind of farming: high input, high yield, high throughput, that made sense for the companies operating at scale within it, but that was increasingly marginal for the individual farmer trying to survive inside it. The grain elevators, the fertilizer dealers, the seed companies, the equipment manufacturers, all of them were profitable precisely because the standard model consumed a great deal of product. Dale's transition made him less valuable to all of them as a customer, and at various points he felt this in the form of reduced service, less attention from sales representatives, and the occasional quiet suggestion from someone in the system that he was making things harder than they needed to be. He made things harder than they needed to be. And the hardness produced something the easy way could not. In the spring of 2023, on a morning in late April when the soil temperature had just crossed 50 degrees and the ground was ready to receive seed, Dale Rutger walked across his south field, the 80-acre parcel that had once been a problem, that had once ponded and shed water and produced inconsistently, and he bent down and pushed his fingers into the soil the way his grandfather had done and the way his father had done, reading the ground the way you read a page, looking for what it was telling you. What the ground told him was that it was alive. The structure was crumbly and dark and held its shape when squeezed, the way good soil does, the way soil does when it has been understood rather than merely used. The earthworm count in a single square foot, which he still tracked occasionally out of habit, was higher than anything he'd measured in his first years of farming. The smell of it, the clean, complex smell of healthy soil biology at work, was different from the smell of his fields in the early 2000s, when the tillage and chemical load had simplified everything underground to a gray-brown uniformity. He was 54 years old. He had been farming this ground for 30 years. He had made one large decision in the middle of that time that everyone around him believed was wrong, and it had turned out to be the most important decision he had made as a farmer, not because it had made him wealthy, because it hadn't, not by the standards of the people who measured success in acres and equipment, but because it had made his farm sustainable in the original sense of that word, which is simply the ability to continue. The 2012 drought had come and he had survived it better than his neighbors. The commodity price crash of 2015 and 2016 had come and he had survived it better than his neighbors. The wet spring of 2019 had come and he had been in the ground on time when others were not. Each disruption that the system threw at the farmers of Fillmore County had found his farm in a more resilient position than the farms around it, not because he was lucky but because he had spent 13 years building a soil that could absorb disruption. The village had laughed at him, or the nearest thing to laughing that rural Nebraska produces, the careful, quiet kind of doubt that is expressed in pauses and redirected conversations and calls from brothers-in-law. And he had not argued back, had not defended himself loudly, had simply continued doing what he had decided was right, year after year, through the uncertain years and the dry years and the years when the numbers on the operating line were close enough to the edge that Carol checked them every week. What Dale Rutger figured out is not a secret. The science behind it is published in journals that anyone can read. The economics of it are documented in USDA reports and university extension publications. The farmers who have done it in Nebraska and Kansas and South Dakota and across the Corn Belt have not hidden what they learned. The information is available. What is not available, what cannot be transmitted through a paper or a field day or a NRCS cost share program, is the specific quality of conviction required to move through a transition period during which every signal from the system around you says you are wrong, and to keep moving in the direction you have decided is right because you did the reading, you did the math, and you trust what the ground is telling you over what the system is rewarding. That quality is not unique to farming. It shows up wherever a person decides to understand something at a deeper level than the conventional wisdom requires, and then acts on that understanding in a context where the conventional wisdom has institutional weight, financial pressure, and social consensus behind it. In those situations, the person who has done the deeper work must carry the weight of their decision alone for a period of time, sometimes years, before the results arrive to confirm what they already knew. Dale Rutger did not set out to prove anything. He set out to farm his ground in a way that would still be possible in 30 years, using methods that would leave the soil in better condition than he'd found it, which is the oldest definition of good farming that exists. He was not anti-technology or anti-science or anti-market. He was pro-soil, in the specific, practical sense of a man who understood that the soil was the actual product of his work, not the corn, not the bushels, not the futures contract, and that everything else followed from that. The village stopped laughing a long time ago. Most of them are asking questions now. That is also how these things go, slowly, laterally, person to person, with a great deal of looking at the ground before people say what they're thinking. The ground, in the meantime, keeps its own counsel. It does not care about consensus. It responds to what is done to it, year after year, with the patience of something that has been here for a very long time and will be here for a very long time after all the elevators and the futures markets and the operating loans have changed beyond recognition. Dale plants his cover crop every fall. The green comes up in October, visible from the road. He lets it grow.